to the final week of CIS325 data communications. The outline for this week will include the importance of network security, security goals, network controls, risk assessment, ensuring business continuity, intrusion prevention, recommended practices, and lastly, implications for management. Thank you.
Now we'll discuss the importance of network security, and I will try not to be condescending. Sometimes it's excusable, sometimes it's not. Security has always been a major business concern, and the average value of organizational data and application far exceeds the cost of networks. Think of the recent breach we had with Equifax. If their site went down because they lost a router or something like that, people aren't going to be too upset. People aren't going to get mad at them because the cost of their network, had a failure or a switch failed or something. Nobody's going to be mad. But when your social security numbers information's been stolen, people are going to care a lot more. So the value of the data and the applications far, far exceed the cost of networks. And losses associated with security failures can be major. You got a financial loss due to theft and from system downtime, but the financial loss from the system downtime should not be more than the loss due to the theft itself. And that seems to me the way they treated the Equifax breach. It does result in the loss of consumer confidence, and the handling of these breaches is very, very important. I don't know if you are all aware of the Yahoo breach that occurred a couple of years ago, but they never did determine what caused that breach. So keep that in mind. There's fines that also result in big losses of income and loss of money for these companies. And a lot of times it's really just negligence. Thanks.
There are three primary concerns associated with the security goals. The initials for that are CIA, which does not stand for Central Intelligence Agency. It stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So, the concerns with confidentiality include protection of organized data from unauthorized disclosure. In other words, the safety of the client data. So when we had our Anthem Health breach, when Target credit cards were breached, that data was not protected, so confidentiality was put at fault. The availability is the degree to which information systems are accessible to authorized users. So, with your websites for your banking and for pretty much anything, they're available 24/7. And the integrity is also a concern, and that is the assurance that the data has not been altered or destroyed, and that really involves backups and proper auditing systems. Thank you. Alright everybody, now we're going to discuss security threats as they pertain to business continuity. Business continuity really means that the business is up and available when it says it's supposed to be. For sites like Amazon, eBay, the availability should be 24/7. A lot of times your banking sites will announce when they're not available, but if that announcement's not been made and their site's not available, security issues can often be the cause. So the threats to the business continuity involve disruptions, which is a loss or reduction in network service, destruction of data, or disasters. They can be natural disasters, they can be hacking disasters, all different types of disasters. And in many organizations, the threat of unauthorized access or intrusion is extremely, extremely important. seems to me like the larger the organization, the more chances that there is that somebody wants to attack it and see what's involved. So external hackers exist, but most unauthorized access involve incidents with employees. This was apparent to me when I first started at Yale, where some data got out into the press that should not have, but it was not the fault of the network or the security of the network being hacked. It was unauthorized use by an employee in the development office. So those are the primary concerns with security threats. Thank you very much. Now we'll discuss network controls. Network controls are safeguards that reduce or eliminate threats to network security. They include preventative controls, defective controls, and corrective controls. Preventative controls are policies or actions that an organization will take to mitigate or stop a person from acting or making an event occur. So really these are preventative measures. SSL certificates are a prime example of preventative controls. With SSL encrypted connections, they're a lot more difficult to hack, although they've been hacked as well recently. You've heard of the heartbleed bug and all that. So those are issues that have existed, but preventative controls are put in place to prevent a person from acting or prevent an attack from occurring. A lot of these also might be preventative measures to block IP addresses in the case of a denial of service attack. That's another example. Defective controls are basically audits, so they're used to determine what can be done. It's common for organizations to hire companies in to do security audits, and that's definitely a defective control. And corrective controls are events that are used to remedy unwanted situations and problems from existing. So preventative controls, defective controls, and corrective controls are important to understand. Thank you. Now we'll discuss risk assessment. It's a key step in developing a secure network is to identify risks. Like I said in a previous slide, a lot of times this involves hiring an external company to come in and do security audits. Levels of risks are assigned to various threats. This is very common in all areas of project management, not just as it pertains to data communications. So like I said, if you do take the project management course, risk assessment is a very major chapter, and it should be considered with all projects. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the different risk assessment frameworks, but please have an understanding of what these are. And thank you very much. All right, this next slide involves the steps associated with risk assessment. These steps literally are right out of the PMBOK guide, or the Project Management Book of Knowledge. So I'll go through them very quickly, but know that this will probably be a major part of your project management course if you do take one. So the risk assessment steps involve the development of risk measurement criteria, or metrics, the inventory of IT assets, the possibility of identifying threats, and the documentation of existing controls. This is a very major step in all project management, and identifying areas for improvement. Thank you.
I'm going to go over this slide really quickly, and I'm going to skip over the next couple slides. Please look at the different impact areas, the prioritization, and the levels of impact. This is one of the first steps in risk assessment, that's developing risk measurement criteria. So go through this in the next couple slides and make sure you understand it. And if you need to refer to external resources for more information, that's great too. And just as an FYI, this very closely follows the PMBOK guide, or the Project Management Book of Knowledge. So these are the steps that project managers follow. Thank you. Ensuring business continuity. This involves making certain that the organization's data and applications will continue to operate even in the face of disruption, destruction, or disaster. Some points to consider include, but are not limited to, virus protection, denial of service protection, physical theft protection, device failure protection, and disaster protection, including natural disasters. Thank you.
Virus protection is important in ensuring business continuity. Almost every organization experiences computer viruses. Most organizations have good controls and software in place that will mitigate a lot of these virus issues from occurring. So widespread infection is much less common than it used to be. And there's different types of viruses. There's worms and Trojan horses. So worms are viruses that kind of tunnel through and get into your network that way. Trojan horses are really, the name Trojan horses are based on Greek mythology, where the Trojan horse was rolled into Troy as a gift, and then all the troops got out once they were inside the network. So those are the two types of viruses. Malware does not seem to me to be as significantly covered by different virus programs. I see this changing, but there still are a definite separation between malware scanners and virus scanners. So malware involves spyware, adware, and rootkits. And I would also add ransomware to that list, which ransomware is a type of malware where your data is infected and it's captured and held for ransom until you pay a fine. And if you pay that fine, sometimes you'll get your data back, sometimes you will not. There's no reason why the ransomware people would ever need to pay you back, need to give you your data back. Actually, this happened to the Chicago Police Department, and that was a recent news story. Threats are mitigated using antivirus software, and training is a major concern as well. Teaching staff how to avoid viruses is very important. Thank you. This diagram illustrates what a typical distributed denial of service attack looks like. Thank you. Continuing with our discussion of business continuity, we'll now go into the concept of threat protection. It's mitigated using physical security and training. So that involves training staff to, lock doors, training with alarm codes, alarm policies, other safety concerns such as that. And physical security is also involved. That might be people, that might be physical devices such as cameras and such. And the next concept involves device failure protections. Since servers and computers are machines, they will eventually fail. And identifying and understanding these failures, we can reduce the impact of the failures. This is really common in a SAN where an array is used, or even on a standalone server where it involves multiple disks that are using what's called RAID, which stands for Redundant Array of Independent Disks. So here at Albertus, for our important servers, we use RAID 5, which is a very, very common and very powerful redundancy setup is involving the disks. So with RAID 5, you're allowed to have several disks fail, and your data still is not compromised. And usually RAID machines are hot swappable, meaning you can pull a defective disk out, pop a new disk in, and it will synchronize automatically, and you'll be back up and running. So RAID is an important concept to understand, and it involves failure. The higher levels of RAID also include that much more disk space is required for this redundancy. So the higher level of RAID, the more disk space is used, but the more protected the data is against failure. UPSs are commonly used to keep a system up and running. These UPSs might run battery, or really just big battery packs. They might be backed up and protected through the use of a generator in the event of a power failure. So these are important concepts to understand. I've already discussed the concepts of failover and load balancing and high availability clusters. So understand these concepts of business continuity. Thank you. Now we'll discuss disaster protection. Avoidance is a primary concern. One example of a disaster protection avoidance is storing data in multiple locations and avoiding keeping server rooms and data in areas prone to natural disasters. So here at Albertus, a good place to have the server room would be on the hill because it's less prone to flooding, for example. And backups should often be kept up off-site, whether the data is sent off-site through the network or through the collection of tapes by companies such as Iron Mountain. Disaster recovery is also important. Every organization needs to have a clear DRP or a disaster recovery plan. So this disaster recovery plan should involve the ability to identify different types of disasters, provide recovery plans, and specify what controls will be used. And some organizations actually are involved with disaster recovery, and oftentimes, well, not often, but sometimes organizations will outsource to disaster recovery firms to handle disaster recovery needs for them. Thank you. Intrusion protection involves several different concepts. It involves a security policy and it involves physical security. There's different types of intruders. There's the type of intruder known as a script kiddie, and that's really a novice user who's normally just trying to be malicious. They're using software created by others to run their scripts. They might see something on YouTube. They might even rewrite the script themselves, but they don't really understand what they're doing. Other types of intruders are recreational hackers. They're motivated by philosophy or entertainment. You've heard of the group Anonymous. You've heard of WikiLeaks. We discussed that in the on-ground class last week a little bit. Those are recreational hackers, and they have a philosophy that is somewhat confrontational, and they are the recreational hackers. Professional hackers, well, WikiLeaks could also be considered a professional hacking organization because they're highly skilled, and they do involve espionage and fraud. So WikiLeaks is they're definitely professional hackers, but I think they're somewhat recreational hackers as well. So certain types of professional hackers are okay. Those are companies that are designed to hack your system and try and find weaknesses in your network. So a lot of times hackers can be white hat hackers and they can be legitimate, but they're not necessarily considered intruders because you're expecting them to do their analysis and their hacking. Normally they don't do denial of service attacks as a test because that will actually work in many cases, and it will actually cripple your network in many cases. Another type of intruder is an organizational employee, such as the instance that occurred at Yale where some information was leaked to the press from our system and our network was not compromised. So those are the types of intrusion, and that's the concepts associated with intrusion prevention. Thank you. Intrusion prevention really is assisted by the use of firewalls. Almost every organization nowadays uses a firewall, and firewalls restrict access to the network. They can restrict access to the network based on IP address, based on port, all kinds of different protections that can be used in firewalls. Packet level firewalls involve the examination of the source and destination address of every packet, and filtering can be done with that to allow or deny certain types of messaging. And using access control lists, or ACLs, decide which packets are allowed or denied. This is really influential and can have a large impact in smaller organizations in the prevention of denial of service attacks. So It's not perfect because the traffic does get to the firewall and the traffic could provide the bottleneck in a denial of service attack. But it can also prevent malicious traffic from getting through. And it can just generally prevent traffic coming in on ports that you aren't even thinking about. So it can help prevent access to servers which otherwise the outside world might not even know about. So firewalls are a very, very important concept involving intrusion protection. Thank you. This diagram below explains how a packet level firewall can be set up. So take a look at this diagram, read the book, and it should give you a good understanding of the packet level firewall that we discussed. Thank you. Now let's talk about intrusion protection. We have application level firewalls, which use a stateful inspection to examine traffic at layer 5 for bad behavior. So you have a lot of times where people consider routers to be firewalls just because they can block traffic from certain ports and they can be programmed. A modern day application layer firewall where it actually looks at what's being done specifically and not just where it's coming from and what port it's using. The application layer firewalls are much, much more in depth. Then there's also the concept of network address translation, or NAT. That's where it converts one IP address to another, often from a publicly routable address to a private address. So many of you may notice that your business addresses are all on 10 networks and all of your internal home networks are on 192.168 networks. That's because NAT occurs at your cable modem. So if you look at your outside firewall, just go to Google and type, "what is my IP?" It'll be totally different than if you do an IP config at your DOS prompt or an if config at your OS 10 prompt. Thanks. Now we'll discuss encryption. I've mentioned SSL earlier as within SSL certificates. That's a very common type of encryption. Encryption involves disguising information using mathematical rules, thus providing confidentiality. The strength of the encryption is based upon the strength of the algorithm and the strength of the key. So there's many, many different encryption levels of SSL. You can talk about 1024-bit encryption, 2048-bit encryption, and that is something that's configurable. Often the algorithm is widely known, and a brute force attack on encryption means trying every single possible key. Thank you. Now we'll discuss asymmetric encryption, or also public key encryption. SSL is commonly used as public key encryption. It involves a pair of keys being used. Usually it involves a public key, which can be publicly shared, and the other key is the secret private key. So the message is encrypted using one key and can only be decrypted with the other. So a lot of times on your browsers you'll have what's known as a trust store, and the trust store includes the root certificate and some intermediate certificates that would be provided and available from the certificate authority. Some certificate authorities you may have heard of include like GoDaddy, VeriSign, you might have heard of Entrust. These are providers of, or certificate authorities. I personally have made my own Alberta certificate authority for internal sites where I have to put the root key and the intermediate keys into the trust store themselves because they aren't there. Browsers such as Microsoft, Chrome, Opera, any other type of browser is going to have its own trust store, and these root certificates and the intermediate certificates are frequently updated, thus making it able to decrypt the keys. Oftentimes, public key encryption is based on mathematical calculations that are easy in one direction but difficult in the other direction. And RSA is a very common type of encryption method in calculation algorithm. So you can see all kinds of RSA keys. Many times you can tell the type of encryption being used based upon the certificate itself. If you go to any website which has an HTTPS, using the HTTPS protocol, and you click on the lock next to it, you can usually see a lot of information, including the type of public encryption used. So oftentimes it will be RSA, it might be AES, but there's many different types, and it's important to understand that. Thank you. So now we're going to talk about the public key infrastructure, which is a set of hardware, software, organizations, and policies to associate a set of keys with an individual or organization. One of the most commonly used PKI infrastructures is SSL, and its use with securing connections. SSL and the PKI infrastructure involve the use of certificate authorities, which are trusted organizations that issue digital certificates, proving that an individual organization owns the key. So, like I said, you can create your own certificate authority. I have my own here for on-campus stuff. It would be useful off-campus. However, browsers that are out there, none of them will have my certificate authority, so it will trigger a certificate error that it's not from a trusted authority if I were to use something like that. But internally, I'm able to import the certificate to a server here, a server there, and create a highly secure connection. So digital certificates can be used to authenticate messages. Thank you. There's several different types of applications that are used for encryption. Encrypting files and emails can be done using the Pretty Good Privacy application, which stands for PGP. I believe that is run by Symantec. There's also a lot of open source versions, which is called GPG. I don't know what that stands for, but I know that's the open source free version of the Pretty Good Privacy encryption. So understand that there's PGP and GPG. So one example of this, when your SAT scores are sent to Albertus, they are encrypted using a cipher within PGP. So anytime we get a file with SAT scores, we have to use PGP keys to decrypt and encrypt them. And the transport layer security, or TLS, succeeds secure socket layer, which is SSL, we've discussed that, as the primary encryption protocol on the internet. So most SSL transfers and most security on the internet is now TLS. Thank you. Now we'll discuss user authentication as a method of intrusion prevention. User profiles are used to manage access to resources. There's several different types of authentication. There's something you know, such as a PIN number, a password, or a passphrase in some cases. So that's really just a scrambled set of words or letters that you know. So I'm sure you've all heard before there are types of passwords called dictionary type passwords, which involve words that are in the dictionary. Hackers use the dictionary sometimes to crack passwords, so you should not use dictionary type passwords. Also, user authentication can be based on something you have, such as an ID card, an access card, a smart card, a token, or maybe there's an app on your phone. So at Albertus, your ID cards to get into the building, if you have ID access and you live in the dorms, that is controlled. That's an access card. That's a type of user authentication. And it can also be based on something you are. It can use biometrics such as retina scans, fingerprinting, and something like that. So something that you are is definitely the most secure type of authentication. And something you have would be probably the second most secure. And passwords, they get cracked all the time. However, that's still very commonly used. So you can use multiple types of authentication to use increased security. So if you had a retina scan and a password that you had to key in, that would be more secure than just having a retina scan, let's say. And it's also important to understand that most organizations are moving towards centralized authentication. Thank you. On this slide, recommended practices, and the next slide, implications for management. Please review the slides here as well as the textbook. And I would like to say it's been a pleasure having you all in this class, and I thank you for your participation. Have good luck on everything you do, and thank you.